911.
Ma'am, I killed my boyfriend in self-defense.
Okay, where are you at?
I'm at 12 Meadow Lane, Highland Heights, Kentucky. Ma'am, I killed him in self-defense.
Okay. Hold on. What did you kill him with?
A gun, a loaded gun in the house.
Where are you?
I'm standing about 10 feet from his dead body.
Okay, are you sure that he is dead?
He's dead, ma'am. He's completely dead.
Okay, and is this your gun?
No, this is his gun. He keeps loaded guns in the house.
Okay, what's your name?
My name is Shana Michelle Huber. I can hear myself echoing in the background, ma'am.
It's just the phone system. The phone system has got a delay.
Are they going to arrest me?
Ma'am, I don't know what they'll do. We're going to send them out.
I mean, I'm not a murderer, ma'am. I just killed him.
What happened exactly? What happened?
He beat me and tried to carry me out of the house, and I came back in to get my things, and he was right in front of me, and he reached down and grabbed the gun, and I grabbed it out of his hand and pulled the trigger, and I killed him.
Okay, have you had a history of domestic violence with him?
Yeah. I was just very frightened. He's a lot bigger than me. And because he was twitching and I knew he was going to die anyway, and he was making funny noises, I shot him a couple more times just to kill him. Because I knew he would have been.
I'm sorry, you said you shot him a couple more times after that?
Yeah.
How many times did you shoot him total?
I don't know. Enough to make sure he was dead. Because he was twitching so bad, I didn't want to watch him lay there and twitch.
So you shot him instead of calling 911?
Yeah, I did, because I knew he was going to die anyway.
Hubers has called 911 to report her deceased boyfriend and that she has killed him. But what she's also offering the dispatcher is a level of detail about how she killed him and a distancing from any aspect of him that's human. She's referring to him as a dead body. She's automatically telling the dispatcher she did this in self-defense. And that's a little unusual. The majority of people would make the decision to get help if somebody was shot accidentally. Your first thought is not to finish the job.
You want something to drink? You want some water? Okay, yeah, I need you some water. Go ahead and sit down. You're fine. All right? You're fine. I'll shut this. I'll give you some water. I'll be with you in just a second. You're fine.
It's very unusual that she whimpers, seems distraught for the first couple of seconds, but then almost like she switches off and it's a completely different person. She changes her demeanor as soon as the detective leaves the room. That would not be typical of someone who just killed her boyfriend and who's completely overwhelmed at having done such a horrific thing.
I have to read you what's called your rights, okay? Your Miranda rights. It protects you, it protects me, okay?
Yeah. I really want to have an attorney present.
Okay, do you have an attorney?
My parents could get me one.
Okay, what was his name?
The man that I killed, Ryan Carter Poston. What am I doing tonight? Am I getting to go home?
I haven't had the foggiest at this point. I've just still got to talk to a couple other people, okay?
I honestly, shot the man in self-defense.
Well, that's the kind of questions I was going to ask. When you make the statements, that's fine. But I can't ask you any questions because you want an attorney.
Well, if I waive my right to just speak and not have an attorney today, could that prevent me from going to jail tonight?
I can't promise you anything, okay?
Psychopaths, because of their lack of empathy, essentially they're at the center of their universe. Everyone else around is for their pleasure or should be eliminated because they're some kind of roadblock to what they want to get. And what we see here is already evidence of that. I think she's fully aware that she's killed somebody. She thinks she's smarter. She thinks she should get away with it. She should not be held accountable. I should be able to walk out tonight and be done. Isn't that right? And when it turns out not to be true, that's when things start to unravel.
I really love him. And it's just really messed up that we had to get into a physical fight and then this had to happen, you know? And if I could go back and do all over again, I would rather have my head beat into the coffee table. I know it sounds so bad, but he was so abusive to me that all those feelings are like, it's like, I feel really bad about it because I really loved him. But he was so abusive to me today and in the recent past that it's like, I feel like that's evil of me in my heart.
It's important to realize that she's already asked for a lawyer, and yet Hubers can't seem to stop talking. Her need to manage impressions and to push forward her narrative is really what's taken over.
Hubers felt relief because she had enough. And that's very consistent with the psychopath. Good psychopaths learn how to mimic genuine human emotion, attraction, compassion, love, anger, resentment. And what we're seeing here is her attempt to do that.
I remember more details and more of the nasty things he said, and him shutting me in the door, shutting my arm in the door, even at the floor, and taking me out and throwing me into the bookshelf. That's when he started screaming all the nasty things at me. You're a hillbilly. Everyone knows you're crazy. I remember now that he's doing it at TV, the big screen.
She's setting up the story now in even more detail, saying, I'm remembering things. Whether it's her arm shutting the door, whether she's thrown against the bookshelf, whether she's smashed her head into the TV set. But at the scene, the bookshelf is undisturbed. Things are still in immaculate order on the shelf. There's no crack in the screen. She doesn't have any bruises, doesn't have any marks on her. So what she's saying doesn't match the physical reality.
And put his arm across the table and had it in my face and was screaming at me at the top of his lungs. Hillbilly. I hate you. I hate your Eastern Kentucky accent. I hate your mother. I hate your child. I hate everything about you for what you are. I remember screaming, reaching up to grab his shirt. You mocked my family, my mother, and my family.
And what's interesting in this segment of the interrogation is she really moves away from any physical abuse and essentially describes a motive for killing him. He was insulting her and her family. How dare he? Odd to say, but psychopaths are usually very sensitive people too. In many cases, their behavior, their demeanor is born out of a self-esteem which is very fragile, which is very sensitive to a perceived insult. And what happens once the psychopath feels insulted in any way is a catastrophic reaction of rage.
And he wasn't completely standing up. He was like this. He was sitting, he was enough that when I shot him, he went like this. Literally. That's when I knew he was dead. Or close to it. And I couldn't, I let him, I still, even though it hurt, I still loved him. But I couldn't stand to watch him twitch. I walked around the table. think that's when I shot him in the head. I knew he was going to die or have a completely deformed face. He's very vain. One of our last conversations we had that was good was that he wants to get a nose job. Just that kind of person. And I shot him right here. I gave him his nose job. He wanted.
She wasn't going to give him up to anybody else. But she shot him in the face. That's a very personalized way of killing someone. She could have shot him in the chest or the heart. That might be sentimental, but she shot him in the face. And she was angry, and she was going to pay him back. And I think shooting him in the face was deliberate, yeah. I don't think it was an accident.
I shot him probably 6 times. Shot him in the head. He fell onto the ground. He was like laying like this. He was twitching some more. I shot him a couple more times just to make sure he was dead. Because I didn't want to watch him die. I don't know if anyone will ever want to marry me. They know that I killed a boyfriend in self-defense. Not funny, but he wasn't a good person. And I know that I'm the one that's here and he's not. But the caliber of person that I am is like supersedes him on so many levels. And everyone knows it. I don't blame myself, though. I blame the way that he treated me today. The only good thing is that he can't mistreat me anymore. Even if I suffer dearly for it, I can't be hurt anymore. That feels really good. You know?
That line, I wonder if anyone will want to marry me. It's not the usual line people have when they're being detained after having shot someone. So from a psychological standpoint, we have to take it as a significant indicator of what's seriously important to her. I'd really want to know how long this has been an obsession. If Ryan was saying, no, I'm not marrying you, I'm moving on to other people, he's thwarting that fantasy. And now that he's gone, she's wondering, well, I wonder if there'll be another prospect, which means that the idea of being married is much more important than who she's going to marry.
I'm gonna... Okay, thanks. Yep. Is there a death penalty in Kentucky? What are they gonna do with me?
I don't know. They just told me to come here and sit with you. Did you have enough to drink?
Were you one of the officers at the scene? See, I walked a lot. I don't really remember. Did you go in and look at his body?
Not yet.
Is it still laying there?
I don't know, ma'am. They just told me to come and sit. I'm just here to sit with you, ma'am. You're talking to the wrong person. Okay?
Should I have let him hurt me? Should I have taken a chance? Can I talk to Amber?
She's coming back in a little bit. Yeah.
The narcissism that Hubers struggles with is really seen here because she doesn't have an audience. It's difficult to engage in impression management if nobody's paying attention to you. And essentially, this officer's not paying attention to Hubers. And what she does is she doesn't tolerate it. She pretty rapidly asks to have Amber brought back in. And Amber is this female officer who somehow Hubers has fused with and believes might be her best shot at convincing them that this was self-defense.
Mm-hmm. I did. Yes, I did. I can't believe it. Kill him. Kill him. He murdered.
Who sings to themselves after they've killed somebody? This is like she's finally grabbed the brass ring. She's almost surprised at herself that she was able to succeed. She refers to herself in the third person. We all have parts in ourselves, right? The part that is wife or husband or father or daughter or is all a little bit different. Sometimes psychopaths don't integrate these parts so well. So in order to get through their daily life, they have to split apart parts of themselves and sort of put them in a box and only let them out when the opportune time arises. And I think that's what we're seeing here, is her saying to herself, I'm a killer.
I don't even know what to do right now. I can only imagine what's going through these people's heads. You just can't treat somebody like that. You can't push somebody around the room. You can't throw somebody into the ground. I probably have rug burns. I was thinking about that. I probably have rug burns. I don't know if I can find any. I did have my clothes on. And I don't have any marks, but I was thrown around the room. I probably do on my legs, actually. I was thinking about that. I probably do have some bruises. How about that? My shoulder hurt. I think he grabbed me by the shoulder. I'm a bit better now. I'm even alive to remember.
As time has gone on and Hubers is sitting in this room waiting to be released, what's likely happening is she's playing back things that she has said to the dispatcher and to the case agent about how things happened. And she's starting to realize the crime scene might not look like that. My body doesn't look like that, like there was a struggle. She starts to play back things she said and tries to plug in holes and gaps. And when Hubers says he isn't alive to remember, what she might be telling us is he's not alive to testify against me.
I am really not a bad person. I think anybody who knows me knows that. I mean, look at me. Like, I'm motivated, I'm educated, I love people. My degree is in counseling psychology. I want to help people. I just want like this is what I did with you and that wrong.
A woman is behind bars tonight. Shayna Hubers is charged with the murder of her boyfriend. Highland Heights police responded to the report of a person shot at 12 Meadow Lane last night around 9. That's when they found the victim, Ryan Poston. The 29-year-old had been shot and killed. Still, no word on a possible motive.
I wanted to kill myself. But that's not gonna help anything. You know? I'd rather be alive. I'd rather be alive. And I'd rather be alive and incarcerated. My grandma always told me you commit suicide. Do you believe in God? I hate him so strongly for the way that he spoke to me, for the things that he was doing. Can I call my mother? I'll go ask him. Okay, could you ask that for me? Hold on just a second.
We can see her start to play every card she can with this female law enforcement agent. So she invokes a god. She invokes the mother card. She starts to pull at all of the possible heartstrings, in her mind thinking, this is happening, you know, this is working, I'm effective. And as soon as the officer leaves the room, she compliments herself on what a phenomenal acting job she's just done. And that's truly remarkable, truly cold-blooded.
I feel bad for his family. Like, I feel bad for his sisters, you know, 9/11. Like, I genuinely feel terrible for the family. I feel awful. I don't think I should ever have to talk to them about it, though. I don't think that I should ever have to say anything to them. I don't think I owe anybody that. I'm scared for him. Love can turn to hate so quick.
When she says love can turn to hate real quick, I believe she's being absolutely correct, that she could be really loving in one moment, and once she finally heard no, that she becomes enraged and hates intensely. We know that people with psychopathy don't regulate the emotions in the same way that healthy people do. As we mature in life, we gain in that ability to modulate our emotions. And in psychopathy, that's a feature that doesn't really develop. They flip from one state immediately to the other.
I just feel like more emotions than I've ever felt at one time. You know? Have you ever had something happen to you where you felt all these emotions at once? You don't even know which one to pick out of the jar. Part of me, there's a part of me that's very proud. You know? Like, I think that I hate men enough now, after I've been abused, that I think I can be okay, you know, being me. And if I get out, if I don't get any serious consequences, then I could really be happy just having a career, maybe not even ever getting married. Because this is very traumatic, you know. It's very traumatic for me to live with it.
Huber's confusion around her emotions and not knowing which ones to pick out of a jar may be a little window into the fact that she has enough awareness to know that she doesn't experience emotions the way the rest of us do. And what she's really telling us is that she's having a hard time figuring out which emotions she's supposed to mimic.
So she's now developing the story about she has maybe PTSD. So she's kind of a heroic survivor of all the abuse. She is acting. This is a performance for her. She doesn't really care about the fact that Ryan is dead. So there's no genuine grief. And she approves of herself really highly. And she's given herself a pat on the back. She's kind of quite proud of herself.
Here's what's going to happen right now, Shayna. Okay, with everything that we have, I'm gonna have to charge you with murder. Okay, right now. And
right now?
Yeah. Well, we got until you go to court and stuff, and then you decide what they're going to do with it. Okay. But what we're going to do is we'll do a search warrant.
What degree?
Murder. There's no degree.
She would not let the relationship end. He was trying to end the relationship many times, and he was a little too nice about it because he never really wanted to hurt her feelings. He said to me, "This is getting to be restraining order level crazy. I'm not kidding. You need to talk to her." She sent me 75 texts in the last hour.
On the stand, lead investigator Bill Birkenhauer painted Shayna Hubers as a jilted girlfriend who could not let go. Birkenauer retrieved about 20 to 30,000 pages of information from Shayna Hubers and Ryan Poston's phone in the last 8 months before his death. The data detailed an on-again, off-again relationship with Hubers, sending 50 messages for every one that Poston returned.
What does she say to her friend right after she calls Ryan Poston an evil person?
She says when she goes to the shooting range with Ryan tonight, she wants to turn around, shoot and kill him, and play like it's an accident.
It becomes pretty clear at trial, through the testimony of multiple witnesses, that her story, her description of the events, of the quality and nature of their relationship, had actually nothing to do with reality. In fact, this was a situation where she wanted to pursue a relationship, he did not, and she, like a psychopath would, had the thought, well, if I can't have him, nobody will. And how dare he not want me?
At Huber's trial, what starts to emerge is a pattern of behavior where Hubers wasn't respecting Ryan's boundaries. Hubers was bombarding him with text messages, somewhere along the lines of 50 messages to every one of his own. She was engaging in behavior that, if the genders, I think, were reversed, and it was a male engaging in this behavior with a female, we would be much faster as society to label that as stalking, as harassment. But because she is this damsel in distress, young female who is soft-spoken and she's pretty, nobody really labeled it that way until we had a dead person.
I told him to make sure that he was kind to Shayna and that he told her honestly what was going on so that she didn't find out later that he was out with someone else.
That someone was Audrey Bolte, Miss Ohio 2012.
When Hubers found out that he was going to go out on a date with a former beauty queen, that became the straw that broke the camel's back. That was a point she could not let happen. Because once he did that, that meant that their relationship was over. Huber's fragile ego could not tolerate that, and she then went into action. Because as far as she's concerned, he's an object and he belongs to her.
Did she ever at times laugh about certain parts of the incident that happened on October 12th of 2012?
Yes.
Which parts did she laugh about?
Mainly about shooting him in the face and giving him the nose job he always wanted. She said she was going to plead insanity, but then she said that she was too smart because she has an IQ of Einstein, up to the IQ of Einstein, and so she's going to plead the white battered syndrome.
A local breaking news alert now. Shayna Hubers has been found guilty of murder.
Convicted killer Shayna Hubers won't be sentenced until June, but right now her lawyers are trying to get her a shorter prison sentence. They are asking the judge to declare Hubers a domestic violence victim, saying she was abused during her relationship with Ryan Poston. Now, if the judge rules in her favor, she could be eligible for parole in just 5.5 years.
Now that Hubers has been convicted, her legal team is trying to get the court to acknowledge that she be handled as a special victim or a special circumstance, that she was in fact the victim of domestic violence, and that this is a battered women's syndrome case or a battered victims case.
She needs to represent herself as having been in a long-standing relationship that was stable, they were together, they're living together, and that she is the victim of a history of abuse over time. The challenge for her will be, it's going to have to match evidence.
What did you tell the police officer when he asked you specifically, is that your residence?
I don't live with him.
If you would flip that over, is that list of 10 guys on that page?
Sure, I may have slept with 10 guys in 2012, but I don't see how that's relevant to any of this.
Well, luckily that's not up to you.
Keep the civil tongue in your head, number one. And just answer the questions, all right?
When they start looking at the facts, it turns out they're not living together. It's not her house. They're not in a monogamous relationship. He's dating other people. She's been seeing other men. He's been saying, it's over, move on, and she's been refusing to accept that.
What I think happened in that apartment was little more than cold-blooded murder. It's probably as cold-blooded an act as I've been associated with in the criminal justice system in the 30-plus years I've been in it.
Good evening, everyone. A young woman convicted of killing her on and off again boyfriend will get a new shot at freedom.
And it's all because one juror didn't pay child support more than 2 decades ago.
Kentucky law says you cannot serve on a jury if you are a convicted felon.
Okay, so here we are. Thanks again for making time for us. So, the big question, it appears that you've fallen in love.
Yes. If you would have asked me 5, 6 years ago, am I straight, am I bisexual, am I lesbian, I would have said I'm a, heterosexual woman. But things happen in your life, and what I feel for Unique is real, and I don't have a doubt about that in my mind. And that's all we're doing here is exercising our First Amendment right to become married.
I have the affidavit that shows May 2nd as your request to get a marriage license. Have you heard back from anyone yet?
We have not, and in my opinion, I feel like we're being spun already, and I feel as if I've already been retaliated against, so.
Even if it's only been 7 days?
Yes. I feel as if our constitutional First Amendment right to marry, because Unique is biologically a male and I'm a woman, are being violated and we're being retaliated against due to my high-profile case and, my name in Cincinnati.
Some may say because this is more of either a publicity stunt or something to derail your second trial.
This is no stunt. We actually genuinely love each other. I love Richie, Unique, Richard, Devon McBee, Junior. And to me, it's nothing but real. It's nothing but genuine love that we feel for one another. And he would tell you the same. I have a deeper connection with him than I've ever had with anyone in my life, of the opposite sex or same sex. That doesn't matter to me. And this is no kind of joke.
Huber's belief that 7 days of waiting to hear from the Department of Corrections if her marriage will be approved is somehow them retaliating against her just speaks to that sense of entitlement that the rules don't apply to her. Huber's is trying to get the audience to believe that she has this deep love for Unique Taylor, who happens to be transgendered. She still refers to her partner as he. Huber's is not even using the correct pronoun about her partner who she wants to marry. And so the fact that Huber's continues to maintain that it doesn't matter to her indicates to us she really hasn't changed.
How are you different than October 2012?
I think I've grown up a lot. I think I've been through a lot. And I think I was a young girl then, and I think I'm a woman now.
You taking the stand then during this trial?
I'll leave that up to, I'll make that a surprise. We'll put that into surprise.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Okay.
When Huber's is asked by the journalist whether she intends to testify in this retrial, what she says is, we'll make it a surprise. So she has kind of this glib, lighthearted attitude about what is about to be a murder trial. And she kind of handles this like a press conference and like she's celebrity status and everyone wants to know. And so she's gonna leave it as a cliffhanger for the viewers. Nowhere in this interview that Hubers has with the media does she show any signs of remorse, nor does she show any consideration for how Ryan's family is going to be re-traumatized and re-victimized, having to sit through this trial all over again.
A big surprise in court today as a woman accused of murdering her former boyfriend takes the stand to tell her side of the story today.
I played in the marching band. I played the flute and the piccolo in the band. And I was a good student. And I was made fun of and called a nerd. And my parents were very strict and they made me wear more modest clothes than the other children that weren't necessarily stylish, and I was picked on a lot as a child.
Without being too personal, I'm worried that y'all have sexual relations.
Yes, sir.
Was there any issue that was raised as it relates to that sexual interaction?
The issue that I was unable to orgasm during sex. Ryan always put pressure on me to orgasm. He put pressure on me to get breast implants, and he also put pressure on me to remain a certain size or lose weight.
Huber's decision to testify at her retrial when she did not testify at the merits phase of her initial trial speaks to her narcissism. I have a hard time believing her attorneys advised her to get on the stand.
And I think it's important to say here, too, that her history of being abused or bullied at school, if it's true, is not a pathway towards psychopathy. A lot of people, unfortunately, are abused and are the victims of bullying. It doesn't turn them into criminals. So in her mind, she thinks that she can blame these individuals, fellow students, parents, other people in the community, on what she did, when in fact, it's all her.
You testified yesterday, I think the words you said, correct me if I'm wrong, ma'am, that Mr. Poston was callous when you told him about your past?
My perception was that he was insensitive about it.
You asked Mr. Poston the question after you told him what happened, if he thought any less of you.
Yes.
And what was his response to you?
He said he wouldn't.
And in fact, he said that would be deranged for anyone to think less of you.
Yes, he used the word deranged.
There wasn't any data at all that said that he was an explosive, violent, impulsive person. But there was plenty of evidence that friends testified about that she could be manipulative. And I think even at the gun range, she joked about, like, killing him. So that wasn't going to work well for her at the trial, given her defense.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Shayna Hubers, guilty of murder. We, the jury, fix the defendant, Shayna Hubers' punishment for the offense of murder at life imprisonment.
Hubers potentially really thought she might get acquitted the second time, particularly if she took the stand. And that detachment and disconnect from how the rest of the world sees her is consistent with what we see oftentimes in psychopathic individuals. There isn't a moment where we see regret, where we see remorse, where we see empathy, or where we see Huber's ability to think about someone other than herself. And no doubt Huber's decision to testify may have been part of her undoing in how she was convicted again, but also received a tougher sentence.
I'm not your typical murderer. No, not someone that you see on death. He said, you're just a hillbilly from Kentucky. And I am. I guess the hillbilly came out of me.
There are moments in history when an ordinary evening changes in a matter of minutes, and the people living through it do not understand what is happening until it is already too late. On the night of October 1st, 2017, thousands of people had gathered in Las Vegas for what was supposed to be a night of music. The Route 91 Harvest Festival had drawn approximately 22,000 people to an outdoor concert area. On the stage was country music performer Jason Aldean, performing the final set of the evening. For the people in the crowd, there was no obvious reason to believe that anything was wrong. They had come together for a concert. They were surrounded by other people, by music, by the familiar atmosphere of a large public event. But above them, inside the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, a man was preparing to attack them. Stephen Craig Paddock was staying in 2 adjoining rooms on the 32nd floor. From there, he had a view over the area where the festival was taking place. What happened next would become one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern American history. Yet the story of Stephen Paddock is unusual in one important way. In many notorious acts of mass violence, investigators eventually find something that appears to explain the crime: an ideology, a political grievance, a religious motivation, a personal feud, a declaration of hatred, or an organization that helped shape the attack. In Paddock's case, investigators found none of those explanations in a form that could account for the entire event. There was no confirmed political motive. There was no confirmed religious motive. There was no evidence that he belonged to a terrorist organization. There was no identified accomplice. There was no manifesto that explained what he intended to accomplish. There was no message that provided a final explanation for why he chose that night, that location, and those people. The investigation would eventually establish many of the facts surrounding the attack. It would establish who had carried it out. It would establish where he had been. It would establish that he had prepared in advance. It would establish that he had considered other crowded events and locations. It would establish that he had accumulated a large quantity of firearms and ammunition and had positioned himself in a hotel room overlooking a large crowd. It would establish that he had prepared cameras to observe outside the room and that he had planned to take his own life. But the central question remained more difficult. Why? Stephen Paddock was born on April 9, 1953, in Clinton, Iowa. Over the course of his life, he worked in several fields, including the United States Postal Service, the Internal Revenue Service, and companies connected to the defense industry. Later, he became a man of considerable financial means and spent significant amounts of time gambling. People who knew him described him as someone who was not highly social. He lived a relatively private life, and there was no public indication that he was openly committed to an extremist political or religious ideology. Nothing about the public picture of his life provided a simple explanation for what he would eventually do. That is part of what makes the case so difficult to understand. The person who carried out the attack did not leave behind the kind of clear narrative that investigators could simply follow. Instead, the explanation had to be reconstructed from his actions, his preparations, the evidence discovered after his death, and the information gathered during a lengthy investigation. The first important fact is that October 1st was not the beginning of Paddock's preparations. On September 25th, 6 days before the shooting, he checked into the Mandalay Bay. His rooms were positioned on the 32nd floor, overlooking the festival grounds. In the days that followed, he repeatedly brought luggage into the hotel. Employees saw him carrying numerous bags, but at the time there was no clear reason for them to believe that he was preparing for an attack. Only later would the significance of those movements become apparent. Investigators determined that Paddock had acquired a large quantity of firearms and ammunition before the shooting. They also determined that he had conducted research into locations, police response tactics, and ballistics, and that he had personally examined potential locations for an attack. This was not an event that appeared from nowhere. There had been preparation. There had been planning. There had been a process leading toward October 1st. And yet, even with that evidence, The investigation could not produce a single sentence that explained what Paddock believed he was doing or why he had decided that a crowd of strangers should become his target. The choice of Route 91 was particularly significant. Investigators discovered that Paddock had shown interest in other large public events. Among them were Lollapalooza in Chicago and Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas. He had also made lodging arrangements connected to such events. These discoveries suggested that Route 91 was not necessarily selected because of something specific. About the festival itself, there was no evidence that Paddock had a personal grievance against the festival, Mandalay Bay, or the people attending the concert. Instead, investigators considered the location's tactical advantages. From his position on the 32nd floor, he could observe a very large crowd from a distance. The location provided a degree of concealment and made immediate access to him difficult. The evidence suggested that the choice of the location was connected to those advantages rather than to hatred toward a particular group of victims. Then came the night itself. As Jason Aldean performed, approximately 22,000 people were gathered below. Paddock was inside the hotel. Before firing toward the festival, he shot through the door of his room and wounded a hotel security officer. He then began firing toward the crowd. The shooting lasted approximately 10 to 11 minutes, and more than 1,000 rounds were fired. For the people below, the attack transformed an ordinary concert into chaos. Hundreds of people were injured. 58 people were initially recorded as having died in the attack, and the number of deaths associated with the tragedy later increased as some victims died from their injuries. In the first moments, there was also uncertainty about where the gunfire was coming from and whether more than one shooter might be involved. Reports of multiple shooters circulated during the immediate aftermath. Police had to determine the source of the gunfire, identify the correct room, and consider the possibility that another threat existed. Around 10:17 p.m., 2 officers reached the 32nd floor. The wounded security officer helped provide the location of Paddock's room. The officers and other law enforcement personnel then continued checking the area. The door was not immediately breached. The danger had not yet been completely understood, and the possibility of another shooter remained part of the uncertainty facing responding officers. Around 11:20 p.m., officers entered Paddock's room. He was already dead. He had taken his own life with a handgun. The man who could have provided the most direct explanation for the attack was gone. Inside the 2 adjoining rooms, investigators found approximately 24 firearms and about 5,000 rounds of ammunition. They also found cameras that Paddock had used to observe outside the rooms. The evidence suggested preparation not only for the shooting itself, but also for monitoring the response of security and law enforcement. Investigators found no evidence that Paddock intended to escape afterward. His plan had ended with his own death. In the days and months that followed, investigators would examine videos, phone data, computer information, DNA, witness accounts, and the physical evidence left behind. They would investigate the possibility of accomplices. They would examine the reports of multiple shooters. They would search for a political, religious, or ideological explanation. They would look for a personal grievance or a clear target. And eventually, both the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI would conclude that Stephen Paddock had acted alone. But the most important question would remain incomplete. The investigation could tell the world who had done it. It could reconstruct much of what he had done. It could show how extensively he had prepared. It could identify the room from which the attack had been carried out. It could establish that he had planned to die. What it could not provide was one definitive motive. The FBI concluded that there was no single, clear explanation for the massacre. A desire to commit suicide, declining health and physical condition, financial pressures, and a desire for notoriety were among the factors investigators considered as part of a more complicated picture. But none of them, alone, could fully explain the decision. And so the story of October 1st, 2017 begins not with a final answer, but with an absence. Below, thousands of people had gathered simply to listen to music. Above them, a man had spent days preparing for violence. By the time the truth became visible, the night had already been transformed forever. And when the investigation was finally able to reconstruct the events, one question remained standing above all the others. What made Stephen Paddock decide that this was the night, this was the place, and this was the crowd? Before Stephen Paddock became the center of an investigation, before police entered the hotel room and began collecting evidence, before investigators would spend months trying to understand what had happened, there were approximately 22,000 people standing beneath the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. They had come to Las Vegas for the Route 91 Harvest Festival, an outdoor country music event that, until that night, was simply another gathering built around music, entertainment, and the shared experience of being part of a large crowd. There was no indication to the people below that they had been selected as targets. They had no personal connection to Stephen Paddock. There was no known feud between him and the festival. There was no evidence that he had chosen individual victims because of who they were. For the people in the crowd, the evening was not about him at all. It was about the event they had come to attend. That distinction is important when telling this story, because the tragedy can easily become a narrative about the person who committed the violence. His name is known. His movements can be reconstructed. His hotel rooms became the focus of an enormous investigation. His decisions generated years of questions. But the people who stood below him were not characters in his personal story. They were simply people who had gathered in the same place at the same time. The Route 91 Harvest Festival was taking place outdoors in Las Vegas. On the final night, Jason Aldean was performing on stage. Approximately 22,000 people were present. From the perspective of the audience, the physical world around them was familiar: a stage, a large crowd, a performance, and a hotel complex overlooking the area. Above that crowd, however, Paddock had chosen 2 adjoining rooms on the 32nd floor of Mandalay Bay. The physical distance between the hotel room and the festival was significant, but that distance was part of what made the location so consequential. Investigators would later determine that Paddock had researched possible locations and had considered other large public events. His interest was not limited to Route 91. He had looked at events including Lollapalooza in Chicago and Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas, and he had made lodging arrangements connected to such events. Those findings became important because they offered investigators a way to understand his selection of a target. There was no evidence that he had chosen Route 91 because of something specific about country music, the performers, the organizers, Mandalay Bay, or the people attending. There was no evidence of a personal grievance against the crowd. Instead, investigators believed the location offered tactical advantages. It placed Paddock above a very large concentration of people, provided a degree of concealment, gave him a distant position from which to observe the area, and made immediate access to his location difficult. In other words, the people below were not necessarily chosen because of who they were. Their vulnerability came from being part of a large gathering in a location that Paddock considered suitable. That conclusion is difficult to absorb precisely because it removes one of the explanations people often search for after an act of mass violence. Human beings naturally look for a reason. If a victim was targeted because of a personal dispute, the relationship between attacker and victim can provide a narrative. If an attack is motivated by ideology, the ideology can explain the choice of victims. If revenge is involved, investigators can trace the grievance backward. But here, there was no such straightforward connection. The people at Route 91 did not appear to have been selected because of anything they had personally done. They were there, and that was enough. The uncertainty becomes even more striking when the life of Stephen Paddock is considered. He was born on April 9, 1953, in Clinton, Iowa. During his life, he worked in several different fields, including the United States Postal Service, the Internal Revenue Service, and companies connected to the defense industry. Later, He became a man of considerable financial means and spent substantial amounts of time gambling. The picture that emerged was not that of a public extremist who had spent years openly announcing a violent cause. People who knew him described him as relatively unsocial. He lived a private life and did not publicly display a clear political or religious ideology that would explain what was coming. There was no known organization around him that investigators could identify as the source of his beliefs. There was no clear movement that he represented. There was no established network of accomplices waiting for him to act. That absence would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. The investigation could identify a person, but it could not easily identify a cause. The people attending Route 91 had no reason to know any of this. They could not see what was happening inside the hotel. They could not know that Paddock had already checked in Mandalay Bay on September 25th, 6 days before the shooting. They could not know that he had selected rooms on the 32nd floor overlooking the festival grounds. They could not know that during the days that followed, he would repeatedly bring luggage into the hotel. Employees saw him carrying numerous bags, but there was no clear reason at the time to interpret that behavior as preparation for a mass shooting. That is another uncomfortable feature of the story. The signs that later appeared significant did not necessarily look significant when they occurred. A man entering a hotel with luggage is not, by itself, evidence of criminal intent. A guest staying in a casino hotel is not unusual in Las Vegas. A person who spends time gambling is not automatically a threat. Paddock's life, as it appeared from the outside, contained ordinary elements that did not reveal the violence he was preparing. Only after October 1st would those details be examined in a different light. Investigators would eventually determine that Paddock had purchased a large quantity of firearms and ammunition before the attack. They would also determine that he had conducted research into locations, police response, tactics, and ballistics. He had personally examined potential locations. These facts established that the attack was not simply the result of a sudden impulse on the night of the festival. There had been preparation, and that preparation had occurred largely outside the awareness of the people around him. Yet even preparation did not provide the missing explanation. It demonstrated intent, but intent and motive are not the same thing. Investigators could determine that Paddock had prepared to attack. They could establish that he had selected a location with particular advantages. They could later find approximately 24 firearms and around 5,000 rounds of ammunition in his 2 adjoining rooms. They could find cameras that he had used to observe outside the rooms. They could conclude that he had planned to die rather than escape. But none of these discoveries answered the question of why the people below had become his intended victims. The distinction between confirmed facts and unanswered questions would become essential. There was a temptation, as there often is after a tragedy of this scale, to fill the gaps with assumptions. Perhaps there had to be a hidden ideology. Perhaps there had to be an accomplice. Perhaps the attack had to be directed at a particular group. But the investigation did not establish those explanations. The FBI later concluded that Paddock had acted alone and that there was no single clear motive. Investigators considered several factors, including his desire to commit suicide, declining health and physical condition, financial pressures, and a desire for notoriety. These factors were considered as part of a complicated picture, not as a single definitive explanation. That distinction matters because the absence of a simple motive does not make the victims less real, and it does not make the consequences less devastating. The people gathered at Route 91 were not responsible for the circumstances that brought Paddock to that hotel room. They were not participants in a conflict with him. They did not know they were being watched from above. They were simply attending a concert. When the shooting began, that ordinary evening was shattered. Hundreds would be injured, some by gunfire and others amid the chaos as people tried to escape. 58 people were initially recorded as having died in the attack, and the number associated with the tragedy later increased as some victims died from their injuries. Behind every number was a person who had been there that night. The scale of the tragedy can make individual lives disappear into statistics. But the number itself represents something concrete. People who had expected to leave the festival and return to their lives instead became victims of an attack they had no reason to anticipate. That is where the story must remain grounded. Stephen Paddock's preparations may explain how the attack became possible, and the investigation may reveal how carefully he had chosen his position. But the people below were not abstractions. They were the reason the consequences mattered. They were the ones who experienced the sudden transformation of a concert into a scene of confusion and terror. And while investigators would later spend months examining Paddock's life in search of an explanation, the people in that crowd had never been given the chance to ask why. They had simply been there. That fact, more than anything else, would define the tragedy. A gathering created for music had become the setting for an attack whose victims had no known connection to the man above them, and whose lives would forever be associated with a question that even the investigation could not completely answer. Stephen Craig Paddock did not enter the history of Las Vegas as a man whose life had been defined by public violence. Before October 1st, 2017, there was no widely visible identity that would have made the coming attack seem inevitable. He was born on April 9, 1953, in Clinton, Iowa, and over the course of his life, he moved through several different occupations and environments. He worked for the United States Postal Service. He worked for the Internal Revenue Service. He was involved with companies connected to the defense industry. Later, he became financially successful enough to spend considerable amounts of time gambling. To the people who encountered him, these facts described a private individual with an unusual, but not necessarily alarming life. There was no public manifesto announcing a cause. There was no known political campaign of hatred. There was no religious ideology that investigators could identify as the foundation of his actions. There was no terrorist organization waiting behind him. The man who would eventually carry out the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history did not appear. From the available information, to have spent his life preparing the world for what he would do. That does not mean there were no warning signs. It means that the signs that later became important were difficult to interpret before the attack. Paddock lived relatively quietly. People who knew him described him as someone who was not highly social. He spent considerable time gambling at casinos and maintained a private lifestyle. These characteristics, considered on their own, did not provide a clear explanation for future violence. A person can be private without being dangerous. A person can gamble without being violent. A person can have little interest in social interaction without secretly planning an attack. That distinction is important because hindsight can create the illusion that the outcome should always have been visible in advance. Once a tragedy has occurred, ordinary details can seem ominous simply because everyone now knows what came next. In Paddock's case, the challenge for investigators was to separate those ordinary details from the evidence that actually demonstrated preparation for violence. What they eventually found was a man whose behavior had changed from private and unremarkable to deliberate and highly organized in the period leading up to October 1st. The most important evidence did not come from a dramatic declaration. It came from what he did. On September 25th, Paddock checked into the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. He was given rooms on the 32nd floor, including 2 adjoining rooms. From there, he had a view over the area where the Route 91 Harvest Festival would take place. At that point, however, the significance of the location would not have been apparent to the people around him. A hotel guest checking into a casino resort was not, by itself, an extraordinary event. Paddock could enter the building, take his luggage to his rooms, and remain largely unnoticed because that was what hotel guests normally did. In the days that followed, he repeatedly brought luggage into the hotel. Employees saw him carrying numerous bags, but there was no clear reason at the time for them to understand that the luggage was connected to an impending mass shooting. Only after the attack would investigators be able to reconstruct the scale of the preparation that had taken place behind those doors. The investigation established that Paddock had acquired a large quantity of firearms and ammunition. Before the shooting, he had also conducted research into locations, police response, tactics, and ballistics. He had personally examined potential locations for an attack. These discoveries changed the way his final days had to be understood. The attack had not emerged from a single moment of uncontrolled anger. There had been planning. There had been research. There had been preparation. But even as investigators assembled these pieces, an important distinction remained. Knowing that someone planned an act does not necessarily reveal why they wanted to commit it. Preparation can demonstrate intention. It cannot automatically provide motive. That difference would become one of the central problems of the Paddock investigation. Investigators also discovered that his attention had not been limited to Route 91. He had shown interest in other large public events. Among those examined during the investigation were Lollapalooza in Chicago and Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas. He had also made lodging arrangements connected to such events. These findings were important because they suggested that the selection of Route 91 may have been related to the characteristics of the location rather than to a personal grievance against the festival or its audience. There was no evidence that Paddock had a specific dispute with the people attending Route 91. There was no identified individual in the crowd whom he was pursuing. There was no known personal relationship between him and the people who would become his victims. The evidence instead pointed toward a location chosen for its tactical advantages. From a room high above the festival grounds, Paddock could observe a very large crowd while remaining physically separated from it. His position offered distance and concealment, and immediate access to the room was difficult. These were practical considerations, not evidence of an emotional connection to the victims. That distinction makes the case especially difficult to understand. When people search for explanations after an act of mass violence, they often expect a relationship between the attacker and the victims. They expect someone to have been hated, betrayed, rejected, or blamed. But in this case, the investigation did not establish such a relationship. The people below were largely strangers to the man above them. Their presence in the crowd was enough to make them vulnerable to the plan he had developed. Paddock's private nature also contributed to the difficulty of understanding him. He was not described as a public extremist. There was no known ideology that could be traced through speeches, writings, or organized activity. There was no evidence that he belonged to a political or religious movement that encouraged the attack. There was no organization claiming responsibility for his actions. There was no identified accomplice working alongside him. Eventually, both the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI would conclude that Paddock had acted alone. That conclusion meant that investigators had to look almost entirely at the individual himself and the evidence he had left behind. There was no larger network to expose and no group structure to map. There was simply one man, his preparations, and the consequences of what he had done. This was also why the question of his personal state became important. The FBI did not reduce the case to a simple statement that Paddock was mentally ill or that some single disorder explained the massacre. Instead, investigators described a more complicated collection of factors. His desire to commit suicide was considered important. Investigators also considered his declining health and physical condition, financial pressures, his private personality, lack of empathy, and a possible desire to achieve notoriety. These factors were not presented as a single definitive cause. Rather, they formed part of an attempt to understand a man whose behavior had become increasingly focused on an act of enormous violence. The difference between explanation and excuse must remain clear. Understanding possible factors does not lessen responsibility for the deaths and injuries that followed, nor does it transform uncertainty into certainty. The investigation could identify circumstances that may have contributed to Paddock's thinking, but it could not produce one motive that completely explained his decision. That absence is perhaps the most striking feature of his portrait. There was no final speech waiting to be discovered. There was no manifesto that could be read as a key to the entire crime. There was no surviving conversation in which Paddock explained exactly what he intended. He would not stand before a court and answer questions. He would not face victims or their families. The person who knew the most about the reasons behind the attack had chosen to die immediately. Afterward, what remained was evidence: his hotel rooms, his weapons and ammunition, his cameras, his research, his movements, his selection of locations. These could tell investigators what he had prepared to do, but they could not reproduce the thoughts inside his mind. That is why the portrait of Stephen Paddock remains incomplete. He was not an openly declared extremist whose path could be followed through years of ideological statements. He was not identified as part of a larger conspiracy. He was not publicly known as a violent criminal whose previous acts had announced the coming massacre. He was instead a private man whose life contained ordinary occupations, gambling, financial success, and limited social interaction, followed by a period of deliberate preparation that culminated in extraordinary violence. The transformation is difficult to comprehend precisely because there is no single moment in the available record that explains it. Somewhere between the private life he had lived for decades and the preparations he made in September 2017, Stephen Paddock crossed a line that would destroy the lives of hundreds of strangers. Investigators could trace many of his steps after the fact. They could identify the hotel room. They could reconstruct the preparation. They could determine that he had considered other crowded events. They could establish that he had planned for the police response and had prepared for his own death. But the final step remained hidden. Behind the hotel room door, there was a man who had made a decision that thousands of people below could not see coming. And when that door was eventually opened after the shooting, the man was dead, leaving behind evidence of what he had done, but no definitive explanation for why he had decided to do it. On September 25, 2017, 6 days before the shooting, Stephen Paddock checked into the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino in Las Vegas. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about a man checking into a hotel in a city built around hotels, casinos, entertainment, and temporary visitors. Las Vegas was a place where people arrived, stayed for several days, carried luggage through hotel corridors, and then left again. Paddock's presence could easily have appeared to be part of that ordinary rhythm. But his room was not simply a place to sleep. It was on the 32nd floor, with a view over the area where the Route 91 Harvest Festival was scheduled to take place. 6 days later, that location would become the center of one of the most devastating mass shootings in modern American history. The significance of the room was not visible when Paddock first arrived. It emerged only after investigators began reconstructing what had happened behind its doors. Paddock was staying in 2 adjoining rooms. Over the following days, he repeatedly brought luggage into the hotel. Employees saw him carrying numerous bags, but at the time there was no clear reason for them to interpret that behavior as preparation for a mass shooting. This is an important distinction when examining the case after the fact. The fact that a person carries luggage into a hotel does not, by itself, reveal criminal intent. Hotels exist for travelers, and luggage is part of ordinary hotel life. The significance of Paddock's movements became apparent only because investigators later knew what those rooms contained and what would happen there. Before October 1st, there was no complete picture available to the people around him. They could see fragments of behavior, but not the purpose behind them. The investigation would eventually establish that Paddock had acquired a large quantity of firearms and ammunition before the attack. The preparations were substantial. In the 2 adjoining rooms, investigators later found approximately 24 firearms and about 5,000 rounds of ammunition. The quantity of weapons and ammunition demonstrated that the attack was not improvised at the last moment. Paddock had accumulated the means to carry out a sustained assault against the crowd below. Yet the physical evidence raised another question. Why had he chosen this particular location? The answer was not simply that the hotel happened to overlook the festival. Investigators determined that Paddock had researched possible locations and had considered other crowded events. His attention had extended beyond Route 91. He had shown interest in events including Lollapalooza in Chicago and Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas, and he had made lodging arrangements connected to such events. These details became significant because they suggested a broader search for a suitable setting, rather than a personal grievance against one particular festival. There was no evidence that Paddock hated the people attending Route 91. There was no identified personal dispute between him and the audience. There was no evidence that Mandalay Bay itself had become the target because of some conflict between Paddock and the hotel. Instead, investigators considered the tactical advantages offered by the location. From a high floor, Paddock could look down upon a large concentration of people while remaining physically separated from them. The position provided distance, a degree of concealment, and an environment in which reaching him immediately would be difficult. The choice of the room, therefore, became one of the clearest indications that his preparations had been deliberate. He was not simply attending the festival. He had positioned himself above it. He was not merely carrying luggage into a hotel. He was gradually bringing the materials he would use for the attack into the location he had selected. And he was not simply staying in Las Vegas. Investigators found evidence that he had been considering the characteristics of possible locations and the response that might follow an attack. The research associated with his preparations included locations, police response tactics, and ballistics. He had also personally examined potential locations. These details provided investigators with evidence of planning, but they still did not provide a complete motive. This distinction became increasingly important as the investigation continued. A person can prepare extensively for an act without leaving behind a clear explanation of why that act matters to him. The evidence could demonstrate intention, but it could not reveal every thought that produced that intention. Paddock's research into police response was especially significant because it suggested that he was thinking beyond the initial act of firing into the crowd. He was considering what would happen once law enforcement reacted. The attack would not take place in an empty environment. He knew that police would respond, and the evidence indicated that his preparations took that response into consideration. Later, investigators would also discover cameras in the rooms that Paddock had used to observe outside. Their presence suggested that he wanted to monitor what was happening beyond the hotel rooms and to remain aware of the response around him. The rooms were therefore more than a place from which the shooting could be carried out. They had become the center of a carefully prepared operation. But even as the physical evidence accumulated, the deeper question remained unresolved. There was no manifesto explaining why Paddock had decided to attack a crowd of strangers. There was no political declaration. There was no religious message. There was no identified organization behind him. There was no known accomplice. The investigation would ultimately conclude that he acted alone. That meant that investigators were left with an unusual problem. The more they learned about how carefully he had prepared, the more obvious it became that the attack had been intentional. Yet the reason for that intention remained unclear. His actions showed planning, but they did not reveal a single coherent purpose. The absence of a clear motive did not mean that the preparation was uncertain. Quite the opposite. The physical evidence inside the hotel rooms showed how extensive it had been. Approximately 24 firearms, around 5,000 rounds of ammunition, cameras positioned to observe outside, a carefully selected room overlooking a large crowd, research into locations, police response, tactics, and ballistics. These were not isolated coincidences. Together, they formed a pattern. But a pattern of preparation is not the same thing as a complete psychological explanation. Investigators would later consider several factors in attempting to understand Paddock. His desire to commit suicide was regarded as an important element. They also considered his declining health and physical condition, financial pressures, his private personality, lack of empathy, and a possible desire for notoriety. Yet the FBI did not identify one of these factors as the single definitive cause of the massacre. Instead, the conclusion was that the motive was complicated and could not be reduced to one clear explanation. That uncertainty is important because it prevents the story from becoming too simple. It would be easy to look at the hotel room, the weapons, the ammunition, and the location and assume that every aspect of Paddock's thinking can be reconstructed. It cannot. Investigators could reconstruct his movements. They could examine his preparations. They could determine that he had considered other locations. They could identify the tools he had accumulated, but they could not enter his mind. The room could tell them what he had brought there. It could not tell them exactly what he believed he would accomplish. The same was true of the days leading up to the attack. Paddock had been seen moving luggage through the hotel. He had occupied rooms in a high-rise resort. He had prepared equipment. From the outside, these actions were fragmented pieces of an ordinary hotel stay. Only after the shooting did they become part of a coherent sequence. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Preparation can exist in plain sight without announcing itself as preparation. The hotel staff did not possess the complete information that investigators would later assemble. They saw a guest. They saw luggage. They did not see the final plan because the final plan was hidden behind ordinary behavior. By the time October 1st arrived, Paddock had transformed the hotel rooms into the setting for an attack. The crowd below remained unaware of what was waiting above them. The people attending Route 91 had no known connection to him, and there was no evidence that they had been selected because of personal identities or grievances. They were a large gathering in a location that Paddock had determined was suitable. The distance between the hotel room and the festival created a physical separation that would become central to the tragedy. For several days, the preparations continued quietly. Then the night of October 1st arrived. By that point, Paddock had done much of what investigators would later identify as preparation. He had selected the location, brought the weapons and ammunition into the rooms, studied potential locations and responses, and positioned himself above a large crowd. Whatever had been taking shape inside his mind, the physical preparations were now complete. The hotel room stood above the festival grounds, silent and separated from the people below. To everyone attending the concert, the building was simply part of the Las Vegas skyline. To Stephen Paddock, it had become the place from which he would begin an attack. And as the final hours of September gave way to October 1st, the investigation that would later reconstruct every available detail was still in the future. At that moment, there was only a hotel room, a large crowd below, and a plan that almost no one knew existed. One of the most important discoveries made during the investigation into the Las Vegas shooting was also one of the most unsettling. Route 91 did not appear to be the only large public event that had attracted Stephen Paddock's attention. If investigators had found evidence that Paddock had chosen the festival because of a personal dispute, a particular performer, or a specific group of people, the choice might have offered a clearer path toward understanding his motive. Instead, the evidence suggested something different. Paddock had shown interest in other crowded public events, including Lollapalooza in Chicago and Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas. He had even made lodging arrangements connected to such events. These discoveries changed the way investigators looked at the night of October 1st, 2017. Route 91 was no longer necessarily understood as a destination chosen because of something unique about the people gathered there. It appeared increasingly possible that Paddock had been searching for an opportunity, a setting, or a location that provided particular advantages. That distinction is central to understanding the case. When an attacker selects a particular place because of hatred toward the people there, the location and the victims are directly connected to the motive. But when a location is selected because of its physical characteristics, the relationship becomes different. The victims may have no connection at all to the person who attacks them. Their vulnerability comes from being part of a large gathering in a place the attacker believes is suitable. In Paddock's case, Investigators found no evidence that he had a personal grievance against the Route 91 Harvest Festival. There was no identified feud with Mandalay Bay. There was no evidence that he had chosen the people attending the concert because of who they were. Instead, the investigation pointed toward the advantages offered by the location. This was a difficult conclusion because it meant that the victims were not connected to Paddock through any recognizable conflict. They were strangers. Their presence at the festival was enough to place them within the scope of his plan. The investigation into other potential targets, therefore, became an important part of reconstructing his intentions. Lollapalooza in Chicago was one of the events that drew his attention. Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas was another. These events were significant not simply because they were names in Paddock's records, but because they shared a characteristic that Route 91 also possessed. Large numbers of people gathered together in public. The discovery did not establish that Paddock had decided to attack every event he considered. It did not establish exactly when he began considering each location or why one option was ultimately rejected in favor of another. What it did establish was that his attention extended beyond a single concert. He was examining possible locations where large crowds would be present. That finding reinforced the conclusion that the selection of Route 91 was connected to the characteristics of the site. Investigators considered the position of the Mandalay Bay rooms to be particularly important. Paddock had chosen rooms on the 32nd floor, overlooking the area where the festival was taking place. From that position, he could remain separated from the crowd while maintaining a view of a large gathering below. The physical distance offered concealment and made immediate access to the room difficult. The location also gave him time to prepare and an opportunity to observe what was happening outside. These were practical advantages. They were not evidence of an emotional connection to the victims. This distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation searched for a motive that never fully emerged. The evidence showed that Paddock had conducted research into locations, police response tactics, and ballistics. He had personally examined potential locations. His interest in other events therefore fit into a broader pattern of preparation. He was not simply choosing a place at random. He was considering the environment in which an attack could take place and the response that would follow. The more investigators learned, the clearer the planning became. But clarity about the method did not produce clarity about the purpose. It is possible to reconstruct the logic of a location without knowing the emotions or beliefs that made someone want to carry out the attack in the first place. That was the problem investigators faced with Paddock. They could see evidence of deliberate choices, but they could not identify a single belief that connected those choices together. There was no political message waiting at the end of the trail. There was no religious declaration. There was no terrorist organization. There was no identified accomplice. There was no manifesto. And there was no personal grievance against the people at Route 91 that could explain why they had been selected. The absence of such evidence became a recurring theme in the investigation. At first, the question was where Paddock had intended to attack. The discovery of other potential events helped answer part of that question. He had considered other crowded locations. But another question immediately followed. Why did he ultimately choose Route 91? Investigators concluded that the location appeared to have tactical advantages. That conclusion did not mean that every detail of his decision was known. It meant only that the available evidence provided a more convincing explanation for the choice of location than a theory based on personal hatred. The Route 91 festival presented a large outdoor crowd. The Mandalay Bay rooms provided a high vantage point. The physical arrangement separated Paddock from the people below. These characteristics mattered, but they still did not explain why he wanted to attack anyone at all. That remained a separate and much more difficult question. The investigation also had to consider whether the apparent search for other targets meant that Paddock had been working with someone else. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, reports of multiple shooters created additional uncertainty. But as investigators examined the evidence, they found no confirmation of an accomplice or a larger plan. Video, phone data, computer information, DNA, and witness accounts were examined. The conclusion reached by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI was that Paddock had acted alone. The significance of that conclusion was enormous. It meant that the search for an explanation could not be redirected toward a larger organization. There was no network to uncover and no group ideology to trace. Investigators were left with the decisions of one individual. The other potential targets, therefore, became evidence of his individual planning rather than evidence of a wider conspiracy. The discovery that Paddock had considered other events also made one thing clear. The attack was not necessarily about the specific identity of Route 91. There was no indication that the country music festival had somehow provoked him. There was no evidence that Jason Aldean was a personal target. There was no evidence that the audience had been selected because of a shared characteristic. The crowd was simply there. That fact makes the tragedy particularly difficult to understand. People often assume that victims are chosen because the attacker sees something in them that he hates. But in this case, the investigation did not establish such a connection. The people at Route 91 were strangers to Paddock, and the location appears to have been important because of what it allowed him to do rather than because of what it represented. This is also why it is important not to confuse the tactical explanation with a psychological explanation. Saying that Paddock chose Route 91 because the location offered advantages does not tell us what motivated him to seek those advantages. It explains the selection of the stage, not the desire to attack the audience. It explains part of the how, not the why. That distinction remained unresolved even after the investigation had examined his movements, preparations, and other potential targets. Paddock's interest in crowded events demonstrated that he had been considering possibilities. His choice of Mandalay Bay demonstrated that he had found a location he considered suitable. His preparations demonstrated that he intended to act. But none of those facts supplied a complete reason for the violence itself. Investigators would later consider several possible contributing factors, including Paddock's desire to commit suicide, declining health and physical condition, financial pressures, and a desire for notoriety. Yet the FBI did not conclude that any one of these factors was the definitive motive. Instead, the case remained one in which multiple possible influences appeared to overlap without producing a single clear answer. In the end, the significance of Lollapalooza, Life is Beautiful, and Route 91 was not that they revealed a hidden list of victims. They revealed something more limited, but still important. Paddock had been looking at places where large numbers of people gathered. Route 91 ultimately became the location where his preparations ended in violence. The people there had no known connection to him. They were not part of a personal conflict. They were not participants in an ideological struggle. They were simply attending a festival. That may be one of the hardest facts to accept about the case. The investigation could find evidence of selection, preparation, and tactical thinking, but it could not find a reason that made the victim's presence meaningful to Paddock beyond the fact that they were part of a large crowd. And so, as the investigation moved closer to the night of October 1st, the picture became both clearer and more disturbing. Stephen Paddock had considered other locations. He had studied the conditions surrounding potential attacks. He had selected a high hotel room overlooking a large gathering. He had prepared weapons, ammunition, and surveillance equipment. He had created a plan that would place him above thousands of unsuspecting people. Yet beneath all of those facts remained a question that no list of potential targets could answer. Why did he want to turn any of those crowds into victims in the first place? The investigation could explain why Route 91 was a practical choice. It could not explain why Stephen Paddock wanted to make such a choice at all. By the evening of October 1st, 2017, the preparations Stephen Paddock had made over the previous days were complete. He was inside the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, in 2 adjoining rooms on the 32nd floor. Below him, approximately 22,000 people had gathered for the Route 91 Harvest Festival. The setting was familiar and ordinary for a large outdoor concert. Thousands of people sharing the same space, watching the stage, and listening to the final performance of the evening. Jason Aldean was performing. For the people in the crowd, there was no reason to believe that they had become the focus of an attack. There was no known dispute between the audience and Paddock. There was no warning directed at them. There was no indication that the evening was about to become a mass casualty event. From above, however, Paddock had positioned himself in a location that gave him a view over the festival. The distance between the hotel and the crowd would become one of the defining physical features of the attack. Before he began firing toward the festival, Paddock shot through the door of his hotel room and wounded a hotel security officer. That moment became an important part of the later reconstruction because it established that the danger was not limited to the people attending the concert. The shooting then moved beyond the hotel room and toward the crowd below. What followed lasted approximately 10 to 11 minutes. During that period, more than 1,000 rounds were fired. The scale of the attack was enormous, but for the people experiencing it, the first problem was not understanding its scale. It was understanding what was happening at all. A large crowd had been gathered together only moments earlier for music. Then the atmosphere changed. People were suddenly confronted with gunfire coming from a direction they could not immediately identify. In a situation like that, confusion becomes part of the danger. The people below could not see the person responsible. They did not know exactly where the shots were coming from. They did not know whether there was one shooter or more than one. They did not know whether the threat was confined to the festival grounds or whether there were other attackers nearby. What they did know was that something was terribly wrong. Hundreds of people were injured during the attack and the chaos surrounding it. 58 people were initially recorded as having died. The number of deaths associated with the tragedy later increased as some victims died from their injuries. The figures themselves convey only part of what happened. A large number of people had been brought together for an ordinary event, and within minutes, many lives had been permanently changed. Some people were killed, others were wounded, others experienced the terror and confusion of trying to escape. The scale of the crowd also meant that people were not simply dealing with the threat itself. They were trying to move through a large number of other people who were also attempting to understand what was happening and find safety. The attack continued for approximately 10 to 11 minutes. In ordinary circumstances, 10 minutes can seem brief. At a concert, it can pass almost without notice. But when people are exposed to sustained gunfire and cannot identify its source, time takes on a different meaning. The people below did not have the information that investigators would later possess. They did not know about the hotel room. They did not know about the weapons that had been brought there. They did not know about the cameras that would later be found. They did not know that Paddock had spent days preparing. They were encountering the consequences of a plan they had never seen. During the shooting, reports and perceptions of what was happening were uncertain. In the immediate aftermath, there were reports suggesting that there might be more than one shooter. This uncertainty would become important later, but at the time it reflected the confusion surrounding the attack. The people caught in the crowd could not be expected to know the source of the gunfire or whether another threat existed somewhere else. Law enforcement faced the same basic problem from a different position. Officers had to determine where the shots were coming from and whether the attack was continuing. They also had to consider the possibility that there was more than one shooter. The distinction between what people believed in the moment and what investigators later established is crucial. The early reports were part of the chaos of the event. They were not the final conclusion. Eventually, the investigation would determine that Paddock had acted alone. But that conclusion would come later, after extensive examination of video, phone data, computer information, DNA, witness accounts, and other evidence. During the shooting itself, there was no such certainty. There was only an unfolding emergency. The Route 91 festival had suddenly become a place where thousands of people were trying to escape an invisible threat. The hotel above them had become the source of the attack. But that fact was not immediately obvious to everyone below. The physical distance between Paddock and his victims created a particular kind of uncertainty. He was separated from the crowd by the height of the building, while the people below had to react without being able to see the attacker. That separation was part of the tactical advantage investigators would later identify in his choice of location. It also contributed to the confusion of the people on the ground. The shooting eventually stopped, but the end of the gunfire did not mean that the danger was immediately understood to be over. Law enforcement still had to locate the source, determine whether the shooter was alive, determine whether there were additional attackers, and assess the possibility of continuing danger. The first officers who reached the relevant area would not simply be walking toward a known suspect. They were entering an environment in which information was incomplete. Meanwhile, the consequences of the attack were becoming clearer. People had been killed. Hundreds had been injured. Others were trying to locate friends, family members, or anyone they had arrived with. The scale of the crowd made the aftermath particularly difficult. A person who had entered the festival as part of an ordinary evening could suddenly find themselves separated from companions in the confusion. The available data for this account does not provide individual stories for those people, and it is important not to invent them. What could be established is the broader reality. Hundreds were injured, many people were killed, and the crowd had been transformed from an audience into a group of survivors attempting to make sense of an event that had happened without warning. The first official understanding of the death toll recorded 58 fatalities. That figure would later change as some victims died from their injuries. The evolving number reflected the fact that the consequences of the attack did not end when the shooting stopped. The injuries continued to have consequences beyond that night. For investigators, meanwhile, the shooting had created an enormous crime scene. The focus would soon shift upward, toward the Mandalay Bay Hotel and the rooms from which the attack had originated. But before that could happen, law enforcement had to solve a more immediate problem. Where exactly was the shooter? By approximately 10:17 p.m., 2 officers had reached the 32nd floor. A hotel security officer who had been wounded by Paddock provided information about the location of the room. This detail became an important link between the attack inside the hotel and the chaos unfolding below. The officers now had a specific location to investigate, yet they did not immediately breach the room. The possibility that another threat existed remained part of the uncertainty. The reports of multiple shooters had not yet been resolved. The police response therefore developed cautiously as officers checked the area and continued to assess the situation. For the people outside, the attack had already produced its worst consequences. For law enforcement, the immediate crisis was still unfolding. And above the festival, behind the door of the hotel room, the person responsible for the shooting was no longer firing. Stephen Paddock had already made the decision that would determine what investigators would find. When they entered, the attack had ended, but the investigation was only beginning. The 10 to 11 minutes of gunfire had created a chain of questions that would continue for months. How had Paddock prepared? Why had he chosen the location? Had anyone helped him? Had there been another shooter? And most importantly, why had he chosen to attack a crowd of people with whom he had no known personal connection? At that moment, however, none of those questions could yet be answered. The immediate facts were simpler and more devastating. A concert had been interrupted by gunfire. Hundreds of people had been injured. 58 people had initially been recorded as dead. A hotel security officer had been wounded. And thousands of people who had arrived expecting an ordinary night had suddenly found themselves at the center of a tragedy they had never anticipated. The attack had lasted only minutes. Its consequences would last far longer. As officers moved through the Mandalay Bay complex toward the 32nd floor, the story was beginning to change from an unfolding act of violence into a crime scene. The crowd below had survived the immediate danger, but the full explanation for what had happened remained hidden behind a hotel room door. Soon, law enforcement would reach that door, and when they finally entered, they would find the evidence that would begin to reveal just how extensively Stephen Paddock had prepared for the night of October 1st. When the gunfire finally stopped on the night of October 1st, 2017, the danger was not immediately understood to be over. For the thousands of people who had been caught in the attack, the most immediate priority was escape. For law enforcement, however, another problem was beginning. Officers had to determine where the gunfire had originated, identify the person responsible, establish whether that person was still alive, and determine whether there might be another shooter somewhere in the area. In the first moments after a mass shooting, information is rarely complete. Reports can conflict. Witnesses can describe what they believe they heard without knowing where the sound came from. People can report seeing possible suspects in places where no attacker actually exists. In Las Vegas, that uncertainty was intensified by the size of the crowd and the scale of the attack. Approximately 22,000 people had been gathered at the Route 91 Harvest Festival. More than 1,000 rounds had been fired during approximately 10 to 11 minutes. Hundreds of people were injured, and 58 people were initially recorded as having died. The police response therefore unfolded in an environment where the consequences were already enormous. But the exact source of the danger still had to be established. One of the first important links in that process came from inside the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. Before Stephen Paddock began firing toward the festival, he had shot through the door of his hotel room and wounded a hotel security officer. That injury became significant because the security officer could provide information about the location of the person responsible. While the people below were attempting to escape and find safety, law enforcement was working upward through the hotel toward the 32nd floor. At approximately 10:17 p.m., 2 officers reached the 32nd floor. The wounded security officer had provided them with the location of Paddock's room. At that point, officers had something that had been missing during the initial confusion, a specific location associated with the gunfire. But knowing where the suspected shooter was did not mean that officers could immediately enter the room. There was still uncertainty about what was happening inside. Early reports had included the possibility of multiple shooters. The officers could not simply assume that the person behind the door was the only threat. They also had to consider whether there were other dangers in the surrounding area. The response, therefore, required caution. The immediate objective was not simply to reach Paddock. It was to understand the situation well enough to prevent additional casualties. Officers continued checking the area, including the hallway and other rooms. The possibility of another shooter remained part of the uncertainty surrounding the incident. That detail would later become one of the most important distinctions between the first hours of the investigation and its final conclusions. In the immediate aftermath, multiple shooter reports circulated. Later, after investigators examined a large amount of evidence, those reports would not be substantiated. But at the time, law enforcement did not have the luxury of hindsight. They had to operate on incomplete information. The delay between locating the room and entering it, therefore, has to be understood in that context. It was not simply a matter of officers standing outside a door while the crisis continued. They were dealing with the possibility that the situation might be more complicated than a single shooter in one room. The hotel itself had to be considered as part of the potential danger. Every additional room and every part of the surrounding area had to be treated with caution until investigators could establish what had happened. Meanwhile, the people below were dealing with the consequences of the attack. The shooting had transformed a concert environment into a scene of confusion. People had been killed and wounded. Others were trying to escape. The sheer size of the crowd made it difficult for individuals to understand what was happening or to know whether the threat had ended. Some people were attempting to locate companions. Others were trying to get away from the festival area. The available information does not provide individual accounts for each person, so their experiences should not be reconstructed with invented dialogue or imagined thoughts. What can be said with certainty is that the attack had created a mass emergency affecting thousands of people at once. For law enforcement, the central question remained the location and status of the shooter. The wounded hotel security officer's information had given officers a critical lead. The room was no longer an unknown possibility somewhere in a massive building. It was a specific place on the 32nd floor. But there was still no certainty about what officers would find when they reached it. The sound of gunfire had stopped, but that did not automatically mean the shooter had surrendered or that the room was safe. It was also unclear whether Paddock was alive. There was no opportunity to interview him or negotiate with him before entry. The investigation would later establish that he had already decided to take his own life. But the officers approaching the room did not have that knowledge at the time. They had to proceed without knowing what was waiting on the other side. This is one of the reasons the response unfolded over time rather than in a single dramatic moment. A mass shooting creates a chain of decisions, and each decision depends on information that may not yet be available. Officers had to determine the location. They had to consider the possibility of additional attackers. They had to examine the surrounding area. They had to move toward the suspected room, while limiting the possibility of further danger. The uncertainty surrounding multiple shooters was especially significant. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, reports of gunfire from other locations contributed to the belief that more than one person might be involved. Such reports were taken seriously because the possibility of additional attackers could not safely be dismissed. But as the investigation continued, the evidence began to point in a different direction. Investigators would examine video, phone data, computer information, DNA, witness accounts, and other evidence. They would search for indications that someone else had participated in the attack. They would consider whether Paddock had been part of a larger plan. Ultimately, neither the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department nor the FBI found evidence establishing an accomplice. The conclusion was that Paddock had acted alone. But that conclusion belonged to the investigation that followed. It was not available to the officers in those first critical minutes. Around 11:20 p.m., approximately an hour after the first officers reached the 32nd floor, law enforcement breached the room. By then, the immediate uncertainty surrounding Paddock's status could finally be resolved. Officers entered and found Stephen Paddock dead. He had taken his own life with a handgun, and the weapon was near his body. The man responsible for the shooting was no longer alive. That fact immediately changed the nature of the operation. There would be no arrest. There would be no confrontation with a living suspect. There would be no interrogation. There would be no opportunity for investigators to ask him directly why he had done it, whether anyone had helped him, or what he believed he was accomplishing. The answers would have to come from evidence, and the room contained a great deal of evidence. Investigators discovered approximately 24 firearms and around 5,000 rounds of ammunition in the two adjoining rooms. They also found cameras that Paddock had used to observe outside. These discoveries provided a clearer picture of the preparation that had taken place before the shooting. The cameras were particularly significant because they suggested that Paddock had been interested in monitoring what was happening beyond the room. His preparations were not limited to acquiring firearms and ammunition. He had also created a way to observe the environment outside. This reinforced the conclusion that the attack had involved deliberate planning. Investigators would later determine that Paddock had researched locations, police response, tactics, and ballistics. They would also establish that he had considered other crowded events before ultimately choosing Route 91. The hotel room, therefore, became the physical starting point for reconstructing a much larger story. But even with the evidence in front of them, investigators still faced the central unanswered question. The room could show what Paddock had prepared. It could show what he had brought with him. It could show how extensively he had planned, but it could not speak for him. The person who knew the reason for those preparations was dead. There was no manifesto waiting to explain his motives. There was no surviving statement that identified a political or religious cause. There was no evidence of an organization directing him. There was no confirmed accomplice. The investigation had reached its first major conclusion. The suspected shooter was dead, and the immediate threat had ended. But the larger investigation was only beginning. The officers who entered the room that night had found the person responsible. They had not found the reason. Outside the hotel, the consequences of the attack continued to unfold. Inside the room, investigators were confronted with the physical evidence of a carefully prepared act. The contrast was stark. Below, thousands of people were dealing with the human consequences of what had happened. Above, investigators were beginning to catalog the objects that might explain it. In the hours ahead, the question would no longer be simply where the shooter was. It would become a much larger question. Who was Stephen Paddock? How had he prepared for the attack? Had anyone helped him? And what could possibly have motivated him to turn a crowded concert into a scene of mass death? The answer to some of those questions would eventually become clear. Others would remain uncertain. And the first officer standing outside that hotel room could not yet know that the most difficult part of the investigation would not be identifying the shooter. It would be understanding him. When investigators entered Stephen Paddock's rooms on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay, they were no longer looking for a living suspect. They were entering the physical remains of a plan that had already been carried out. Paddock was dead, having taken his own life with a handgun. There would be no interrogation, no opportunity to confront him with the evidence, and no possibility of asking him directly what he had intended to accomplish. Instead, the rooms themselves became the beginning of the next phase of the investigation. What investigators found immediately demonstrated that the shooting had not been a spontaneous act. In the two adjoining rooms were approximately 24 firearms and around 5,000 rounds of ammunition. The quantity alone established the scale of preparation. These were not objects that had appeared in the room by accident. They were part of an organized accumulation of weapons and ammunition that had taken place before the attack. The evidence therefore confirmed something investigators had already begun to suspect from Paddock's movements and preparations. The events of October 1st had been planned. The room also contained cameras that Paddock had used to observe outside. Their presence was significant because it indicated that his preparation extended beyond acquiring weapons. He had also arranged a means of monitoring the environment around his rooms. This was consistent with the broader evidence that he had researched police response, tactics, locations, and ballistics. The cameras helped investigators understand that Paddock had anticipated that events outside the room would matter to him. The hotel room was not merely a place where he happened to possess firearms. It had become the center of a deliberate operation. Yet even as investigators began to understand the extent of his preparation, they encountered a problem that would define the case. Preparation could establish intention, but it could not provide a complete motive. The weapons could tell investigators what Paddock had brought into the room. The ammunition could show the scale of the attack he had prepared for. The cameras could indicate his interest in observing the outside environment. His research could demonstrate that he had considered locations and police response. But none of these things could answer the question of why he wanted to carry out a mass shooting in the first place. That question became even more important because the investigation found no manifesto, no political declaration, no religious message, and no statement explaining his actions. There was no document that could be placed beside the weapons and described as the definitive key to the crime. There was no message that said why the people at Route 91 had been chosen. There was no evidence that Paddock had been acting on behalf of an organization. There was no identified ideological cause. Instead, investigators were confronted with a large collection of physical evidence and a striking absence of explanation. The room also became central to the question of whether Paddock had acted alone. In the first hours after the shooting, reports of multiple shooters had circulated. Given the chaos of the event, those reports could not simply be dismissed. The possibility of additional attackers had to be investigated seriously. If Paddock had been part of a larger plan, the discovery of his rooms might have represented only one piece of a much wider crime scene. Investigators therefore examined the available evidence for signs of another person's involvement. They reviewed video, They examined phone data and computer information. They considered DNA evidence and witness accounts. The search was not limited to the hotel room itself. Investigators looked for indications of communication, cooperation, or a shared plan that might connect Paddock to another individual. The final conclusion was clear. There was no evidence establishing an accomplice. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department determined that Paddock had acted alone, and the FBI reached the same conclusion. This finding was important because it closed off one of the most persistent questions raised during the immediate aftermath of the shooting. The apparent reports of additional shooters had not developed into evidence of a larger attack team. The investigation had found one perpetrator, not a group. But identifying one perpetrator did not make the case simple. In some ways, it made the central mystery more difficult. If an organization had directed Paddock, investigators might have been able to examine that organization's ideology, goals, and instructions. If an accomplice had helped him, investigators might have been able to identify a relationship or shared motive. But the evidence pointed instead to an individual acting alone. That left investigators with the complicated task of understanding a man whose behavior had become increasingly focused on violence without revealing a clear reason for it. The search therefore moved beyond the hotel room and into Paddock's background, movements, research, and personal circumstances. Investigators examined what he had done before the attack and what factors might have influenced his decisions. They considered his desire to commit suicide. They considered his declining health and physical condition. They considered financial pressures. They considered his personality and lack of empathy. They also considered the possibility that he wanted to achieve a level of notoriety through the attack. None of these factors was presented as a complete explanation. Instead, they formed part of a broader assessment in which several influences may have interacted. This distinction is essential. The FBI did not reduce the case to the statement that Paddock was simply mentally ill, nor did it identify a single psychological condition that explained the massacre. The investigative assessment was more complicated. There appeared to be a combination of circumstances and personal factors, but no single cause that could account for everything. His apparent desire to die was particularly significant because he did not appear to have planned an escape. The evidence indicated that he had prepared for suicide. By the time officers entered the room, he was dead. This meant that the attack was not simply an attempt to cause casualties followed by an escape. His own death was part of what he had prepared for. That fact helped investigators understand one aspect of his behavior. But it still did not answer why he had chosen to involve thousands of strangers in the final act of his life. The possibility of notoriety added another dimension. A mass shooting on such a scale would inevitably attract enormous public attention. Investigators considered whether Paddock had wanted to become notorious. But again, this remained part of a broader assessment rather than a definitive motive. There was no surviving statement in which he explicitly said that fame or notoriety was his goal. The investigators were attempting to understand his actions through the evidence available after his death. The distinction between evidence and inference, therefore, remained crucial. The investigation could establish that he prepared. It could establish that he selected a location. It could establish that he considered other large public events. It could establish that he accumulated weapons and ammunition. It could establish that he monitored the outside environment and researched police response. But it could not establish with certainty the private reasoning that connected all those actions. The absence of a manifesto made the problem even more difficult. In many major cases involving ideologically motivated violence, investigators can identify writings, statements, online material, or communications that reveal the perpetrator's beliefs. In Paddock's case, the available evidence did not produce such a clear ideological explanation. There was no political cause. There was no religious cause. There was no evidence of terrorism directed by an organization. The attack appeared to be the work of one man who had prepared extensively and then died before he could explain himself. That reality placed unusual weight on the physical evidence. Every item recovered from the rooms became part of an effort to reconstruct a story that Paddock himself had taken with him. The approximately 24 firearms and 5,000 rounds of ammunition demonstrated the scale of preparation. The cameras demonstrated his attention to the outside environment. His prior research demonstrated that he had considered locations and responses. His interest in other crowded events demonstrated that Route 91 was not necessarily selected because of a unique grievance. Together, these pieces produced a clearer understanding of what he had done. But the final explanation remained incomplete. Perhaps the most important conclusion was therefore also the simplest. Investigators knew who was responsible. They knew where he had positioned himself. They knew that he had prepared in advance. They knew that he had acted alone. They knew that he had died by suicide. They knew that there was no evidence of a terrorist organization or accomplice behind him. But they could not produce one definitive motive. That gap would remain even as the investigation grew more detailed. The rooms had answered many questions about the mechanics and preparation of the attack. They had not answered the deepest question of all. When the door was opened, investigators found weapons, ammunition, cameras, and the body of the man responsible. What they did not find was a simple explanation for why he had decided that thousands of strangers should become part of the final act of his life. The physical evidence could reconstruct his preparation. It could not reconstruct his conscience. And as investigators moved from the hotel room into the wider examination of Paddock's life, they would discover more evidence about what he had done, but still struggle with the question of what, ultimately, had driven him to do it. Why did Stephen Paddock do it? As the investigation continued beyond the hotel rooms and the immediate crime scene, one question became more difficult than all the others. Why? By this stage, investigators had established many of the basic facts. Stephen Paddock was the shooter. He had acted alone. He had prepared for the attack over a significant period of time. He had selected the Mandalay Bay location because it offered tactical advantages. He had acquired a large quantity of firearms and ammunition. He had researched locations, police response, tactics, and ballistics. He had considered other large public events. He had positioned himself above the Route 91 Harvest Festival and opened fire on a crowd of approximately 22,000 people. He had then taken his own life before police entered the room. The evidence could establish all of these things with considerable confidence. But when investigators tried to move from what Paddock had done to why he had done it, the certainty began to disappear. There was no manifesto waiting to explain his beliefs. There was no political declaration. There was no religious justification. There was no video statement in which he announced his intentions. There was no secret organization directing him. There was no confirmed accomplice. There was no identified personal feud with Mandalay Bay, Route 91, Jason Aldean, or the people attending the festival. The absence of these explanations became one of the defining features of the case. Investigators, therefore, had to examine Paddock himself. His background offered a portrait of a man who had lived through several different professional and personal stages. He was born on April 9, 1953, in Clinton, Iowa. During his working life, he was employed by the United States Postal Service and the Internal Revenue Service and worked with companies connected to the defense industry. Later, he became financially successful and spent substantial amounts of time gambling. None of these facts, by themselves, suggested that he would become a mass murderer. His life did not contain a publicly visible ideology that could be traced directly to the attack. People who knew him described him as relatively private and not highly social. He spent a great deal of time gambling at casinos and generally kept to himself. Again, these characteristics were not proof of violent intent. They became relevant only because investigators were trying to understand the person behind a crime that otherwise seemed almost impossible to explain. One danger in examining a case like this is the temptation to turn ordinary characteristics into warnings after the fact. A private person is not automatically dangerous. A gambler is not automatically violent. A person who communicates little is not necessarily concealing criminal intentions. The investigation had to distinguish between characteristics that described Paddock and evidence that explained his actions. What mattered most was the change from an apparently private life to an intensely organized period of preparation. In the months and weeks before the shooting, investigators found evidence that Paddock had accumulated firearms and ammunition and had studied possible locations. He had considered other crowded events, including Lollapalooza in Chicago and Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas. He had made lodging arrangements connected to such events. These discoveries suggested that his interest was not limited to Route 91 itself. He appeared to be examining opportunities where large crowds would be accessible from a suitable position. That finding helped investigators understand the choice of Route 91, but it still did not answer the larger question. If he had no particular hatred of the festival or its audience, why had he wanted to attack a crowd in the first place? The investigation considered the possibility that several factors had combined. One important factor was Paddock's desire to die. His suicide immediately after the attack indicated that his own death had been part of the plan. Investigators believed that he wanted to control the circumstances of his death. That desire did not explain everything, but it provided an important part of the picture. The attack was not followed by an attempt to flee. Paddock did not remain alive to negotiate, defend himself, or explain his actions. He had prepared for his own death, and when officers eventually entered the room, they found him dead. This meant that one of the only people capable of providing a direct explanation had removed himself from the investigation. Investigators also considered his declining health and physical condition. These circumstances were examined as possible contributors to his thinking and behavior. Financial pressures were also considered. Paddock had spent considerable time gambling, and investigators examined the role that financial circumstances might have played in the period before the shooting. But once again, these factors did not produce a simple answer. They were possible elements in a larger combination rather than a single cause. The FBI's behavioral analysis did not conclude that one isolated problem had suddenly transformed Paddock into a mass murderer. Instead, investigators described a complex convergence of factors. His desire for suicide, changes in his health and physical condition, financial pressures, aspects of his personality, lack of empathy, and possible desire for notoriety were all considered. The important point was that none of these could be presented as the definitive motive. The case resisted that kind of simplicity. The question of notoriety was especially difficult. Paddock's attack was certain to attract enormous attention, and investigators considered whether he had wanted to become notorious. But there was no surviving declaration in which he explicitly stated that this was his objective. The possibility had to be considered in the context of the broader evidence. A person who prepares such an enormous attack and then dies immediately afterward may have anticipated that his name would become known. But anticipation is not proof of motive. Investigators therefore treated notoriety as a possible factor rather than a complete explanation. The same caution applied to his personality. The fact that Paddock was described as private and lacking social connection did not itself explain the massacre. The absence of empathy identified in the investigative assessment was more relevant, but even that could not answer why the attack occurred at that particular time and place. The investigation could describe characteristics and circumstances. It could not transform them into a definitive psychological formula. Another important conclusion was that the attack did not appear to be political or religious. There was no evidence that Paddock had acted in support of a political movement or religious cause. There was no terrorist organization behind him. The FBI found no evidence of a larger ideological structure. This separated the Las Vegas shooting from many other cases in which investigators can trace violence to extremist propaganda or organized movements. Paddock's case did not provide that explanation, nor did investigators find evidence of a personal grievance that could have explained the choice of Victims. There was no known feud with the festival. There was no evidence of hatred toward the concert audience. The victims were not connected to him through a recognizable personal conflict. The people below him had simply gathered in a place he had determined was tactically useful. That conclusion made the tragedy particularly difficult to comprehend. If the victims had been chosen because of a specific characteristic, investigators might have been able to identify the logic behind the selection. Instead, the available evidence suggested that the crowd was valuable to Paddock because it was large and exposed. The location mattered more than the identities of the people in it. This also helped explain why he had examined other public events. Lollapalooza, Life is Beautiful, and Route 91 were different events in different places, but each represented a large gathering. Paddock's interest in them suggested that he was searching for circumstances that met his requirements. Route 91 ultimately provided the location he used. The investigation could therefore explain the selection in tactical terms without discovering a personal motive. It was a distinction that remained throughout the case. Investigators could understand the method more clearly than the purpose. By examining his devices and records, investigators were also able to search for evidence of an accomplice or wider conspiracy. They reviewed video, phone information, computer data, DNA, and witness accounts. The purpose was not simply to confirm what had already been discovered, but to determine whether anyone else had helped Paddock prepare or carry out the attack. The evidence did not establish such a connection. The conclusion remained that he had acted alone. That conclusion closed another possible explanation. There was no hidden partner who might reveal what Paddock had intended. There was no organization waiting to claim responsibility. There was no second person who could explain his thinking. The investigation had effectively returned to the same individual with whom it had begun. Stephen Paddock had planned the attack. Stephen Paddock had selected the location. Stephen Paddock had prepared the weapons and ammunition. Stephen Paddock had opened fire. Stephen Paddock had killed himself. And Stephen Paddock was no longer alive to explain why. That final fact shaped the entire investigation. In many criminal cases, even after the evidence is assembled, investigators can question the accused, confront contradictions, or listen to explanations. Here, there was no such opportunity. The investigation had to reconstruct motive from behavior and circumstances rather than from testimony. The result was necessarily incomplete. The final FBI assessment did not claim to have discovered one definitive cause. Instead, it acknowledged that there was no single clear motive. Several factors may have combined, but none could completely explain the decision to carry out the massacre. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the investigation. It is part of the factual record. Sometimes an investigation can establish the who, what, when, and where while leaving the why only partially answered. The Stephen Paddock case became one of those rare and deeply disturbing examples. The investigators could follow his preparation. They could identify his target. They could establish that he acted alone. They could reject the theories of a terrorist organization or confirmed accomplice. They could examine the weapons, ammunition, cameras, digital evidence, and his background. But after all of that, the central mystery remained. Why did a man with no established political or religious cause, no known personal grievance against the victims, and no identified accomplice decide to turn a crowded festival into a scene of mass death? The answer remained fragmented across possible influences rather than contained in one definitive explanation. And because Paddock had died before he could be questioned, the final piece of the story remained beyond the reach of investigators. They could reconstruct the plan. They could reconstruct the attack. They could reconstruct the evidence. But they could never fully reconstruct the mind that created it. By the time the investigation into the October 1st, 2017 shooting had reached its final conclusions, many of the most important facts were no longer in dispute. Stephen Craig Paddock was identified as the perpetrator. He had acted alone. He had prepared extensively before the attack. He had selected 2 adjoining rooms on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. Because the location provided significant tactical advantages over the Route 91 Harvest Festival, he had accumulated approximately 24 firearms and around 5,000 rounds of ammunition. He had used cameras to observe outside the rooms. He had researched locations, police response, tactics, and ballistics. He had considered other crowded public events before ultimately choosing Route 91. He had fired more than 1,000 rounds toward the crowd during approximately 10 to 11 minutes. And when police eventually entered the room, they found him dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Those facts created a remarkably detailed reconstruction of what happened. Yet the final report could not provide the kind of ending people often expect from a criminal investigation. There was no confession. There was no trial. There was no courtroom confrontation. There was no final statement from Paddock explaining his decision. And there was no single motive that could close every remaining question. The human consequences, however, did not depend on whether investigators could explain him completely. 58 people were initially recorded as having died in the attack, while the number associated with the tragedy later increased as some victims died from injuries sustained during the shooting. Hundreds of others were wounded. Still others were injured amid the chaos as people tried to escape. Those numbers became part of the historical record. But numbers alone cannot express the full meaning of the event. Every death represented a life interrupted. Every injury represented a person who had gone to a festival expecting an ordinary evening and instead became part of one of the most devastating mass shootings in modern American history. The people at Route 91 had not entered into a conflict with Paddock. There was no evidence that they had been selected because of political beliefs, religious identity, personal relationships, or a specific grievance. They were not connected to him through an identifiable dispute. They were a crowd. That fact is central to understanding the tragedy. The investigation suggested that the location was chosen for tactical reasons rather than because Paddock had a particular hatred of the festival or the people attending it. His consideration of other large events supported that conclusion. He had looked at Lollapalooza in Chicago and Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas. Among other possibilities, the common element was not necessarily the identity of the people attending. It was the existence of large gatherings and the characteristics of the locations. This made the victims' lack of connection to Paddock especially painful. They did not have the opportunity to understand why they had been targeted because there was no known personal reason. The attack was directed at a crowd whose members were, for the most part, strangers to the person above them. The aftermath also demonstrated that the consequences of a mass shooting do not end when the gunfire stops. The shooting itself lasted approximately 10 to 11 minutes. The investigation continued for months. But for the people whose lives had been changed, the consequences extended beyond the night itself. The available data does not provide individual medical histories or personal stories for every survivor, and it would be inappropriate to invent them. What can be established is that hundreds of people were wounded and that many others experienced the chaos of trying to escape. The tragedy therefore affected far more people than the final death count alone suggests. The immediate emergency became a long investigation, and the investigation became a permanent part of the public memory of Las Vegas. The law enforcement response also became part of the story. Officers had reached the 32nd floor at approximately 10:17 p.m. The wounded hotel security officer had provided information about the location of Paddock's room. Officers then continued checking the hallway and surrounding rooms because the possibility of another shooter had not yet been eliminated. Approximately an hour later, around 11:20 p.m., police breached the room and found Paddock dead. In the first hours, reports of multiple shooters had circulated, contributing to uncertainty about the scale and organization of the attack. But the later investigation did not confirm those reports. Extensive examination of video, phone data, computer information, DNA, witness accounts, and other evidence produced no evidence of an accomplice or a coordinated group. Both the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI concluded that Paddock had acted alone. That conclusion was significant because it removed one of the most persistent possibilities raised. During the early stages of the case, there was no second gunman waiting to be identified. There was no organization operating behind Paddock. There was no confirmed conspiracy that could explain the attack. There was one perpetrator, and that perpetrator was dead. The investigation, therefore, became an attempt to understand an individual rather than dismantle a larger network. It also became a study in the difference between motive and preparation. Investigators could establish that Paddock had planned. They could demonstrate that he had researched locations and police response. They could establish that he had considered other crowded events. They could document the weapons and ammunition in his rooms. They could identify the cameras he had used to observe outside. They could establish that his own suicide had been part of the final sequence. But none of those facts created a definitive explanation for why he had decided to begin the plan. The FBI's assessment considered several possible contributing factors. Paddock's desire to commit suicide was regarded as important. His declining health and physical condition were considered. Financial pressures were examined. Investigators also considered his personality, lack of empathy, and a possible desire for notoriety. But the conclusion was not that one of these factors alone caused the shooting. Rather, the available evidence suggested that several circumstances may have combined. There was no single explanation capable of accounting for the entire event. That conclusion can be frustrating because people naturally want a final answer. A tragedy of this magnitude seems as though it should have a clear cause. If there was no political ideology, no religious motivation, no terrorist organization, no personal grievance, and no accomplice, then what remained? The investigation's answer was uncomfortable precisely because it was incomplete. Some combination of personal circumstances and psychological factors appeared to have contributed, but the precise motive could not be determined. The person most capable of explaining that motive had died by his own hand. This is perhaps the most important lesson in the Paddock investigation. Knowing what happened is not the same as knowing why. Investigators were able to reconstruct the attack in extraordinary detail. They could follow Paddock's movements into the Mandalay Bay. They could identify the rooms he occupied. They could trace his preparations. They could examine the weapons and ammunition. They could establish the presence of cameras. They could identify the wounded security officer whose information helped police locate the room. They could reconstruct the response and establish when officers reached the 32nd floor and when the room was breached. They could investigate the possibility of multiple shooters and ultimately reject it. They could examine digital and forensic evidence for signs of an accomplice and find none. They could identify the absence of an ideological explanation. Yet the final question remained beyond definitive reach. Why this man? Why this moment? Why a crowd of strangers? Why did he decide that the final act of his life would involve the deaths and injuries of hundreds of people who had never known him? No investigation could force an answer from someone who was already dead. The tragedy, therefore, remains defined by two kinds of certainty. There is certainty about the actions and uncertainty about the deepest motive behind them. That distinction should be preserved rather than filled with speculation. It would be easy to create a dramatic explanation that connects every detail and turns Paddock's life into a simple path toward violence. But the available evidence does not support such a story. His earlier employment, gambling, private personality, financial circumstances, health concerns, and later preparations can all be documented. None alone explains the massacre. The responsible way to tell the story is to acknowledge the limits of what investigators could establish. The same caution applies to the victims. They should not be reduced to numbers used only to demonstrate the scale of Paddock's crime. They were people who had gathered for music and entertainment, unaware that someone above them had spent days preparing to attack. Their lack of connection to Paddock makes the violence even more difficult to comprehend. They were not participants in his personal history. They became victims because they were present in a location he had selected. In the years since the shooting, the name Stephen Paddock has become associated with the event, but the tragedy cannot be understood solely through the identity of the perpetrator. The central reality is the lives lost, the people wounded, and the thousands who experienced the attack and its aftermath. The investigation answered many of the factual questions that emerged that night. It established who fired the shots, where he was, how he had prepared, and that he acted alone. It rejected the theories of an organized terrorist attack and a confirmed group of shooters. It also acknowledged what could not be known with certainty. There was no definitive motive, and perhaps that is where the story must end. Not with a dramatic revelation, but with an uncomfortable absence. Stephen Paddock left behind enough evidence to reconstruct the mechanics of the massacre, but not enough to explain the deepest reason for it. The investigation could tell us who he was, what he did, where he prepared, and how the attack unfolded. It could identify the weapons, the ammunition, the cameras, the hotel rooms, the other events he had considered, and the evidence that proved he had acted alone. But it could not give the victims, their families, survivors, or the public the one answer that might have made the story feel complete. The question of why remained unresolved. And perhaps that is the most disturbing conclusion of all. Sometimes the facts can be reconstructed almost completely, while the motive remains forever beyond reach. What should remain clear is not the mythology of the perpetrator, but the reality of the people he harmed. On October 1st, 2017, thousands gathered at Route 91 expecting music. 58 people were initially recorded as dead, hundreds were wounded, and countless others were affected by the violence. Above them, one man had spent days preparing. When the investigation ended, his identity was known, his actions were documented, and his responsibility was established. But his final motive remained uncertain. The case therefore leaves behind a lesson that is both simple and difficult. An investigation can sometimes answer who, what, when, and where with extraordinary precision, while the question of why remains unanswered. And when that happens, the absence of an explanation should not overshadow the people who paid the price.